Here we go. There's Andrew doing good stuff.
Took you long enough.
Yeah, good thing you chose an easy spot. Chapter 23. I came through Talonthorn in hand and looked around to find myself in a meditation room, orange ISO crystals and like pads on the ground. It was really nice. For the first time since being on the World of Trust, I felt like I could feel destiny again. I could have sired if I wanted to, but I held back. I got the sense that somebody was here, and I wanted to have destiny as a backup. I stepped forward through the room and into another room, which was lit by 6 monitors up above, and there was a control panel beneath, machines to either sides. It was kind of weird to see like futuristic stuff, but knowing Prophithia and all of their resources, it made more sense. It was just weird to see it in the World of Trust with like red ISO lamps in the room and lumber, like timber on the far sides. Anyway, a figure in front of the monitors reached to the side and pulled on gauntleted gloves and turned from a chair. And the Prophithian seer turned to me and she said, "Sire of the Darkened, it's a pleasure." And I said, "Same here." And I held Talonthorn out in front of me and sired as as she stood up, she began to sire, and lines of light and color began to connect her to everything around. And in a moment I sired as hard as I could, trusting in that interference to act for me. The streak of lightning bled through the air between us, connecting the Prophithian and Talonthorn that I held in front of me, catching the lightning so it didn't hit me. Because I sired so hard, the lightning was strong enough to completely knock the Prophithian out, and she fell to the ground. I put Talonthorn back in my scabbard and sired to know that she was really unconscious, and she was. And destiny guided me to one of the red lamps, and I took the crystal in my hands, and siring, I was able to change the crystal back to its normal form. But I never realized it had different kinds of interference, and I focused on its ability to interfere with consciousness. And immediately I began to feel tired and exhausted until I stepped away from the lamp, and I dragged the Prophithian under the lamp to keep her under, and I was confident that would hold. And I turned to the monitors themselves to see what was going on. They looked over the city, most of them focused on the generators themselves, the big Prophithian project here on the World of Trust. And on the monitor I could see Scar was already out there attacking the 4-foot by 4-foot generators, all packed in a big complex powered by the dam nearby. And she was making progress, but even with the whole team going, it was going to take hours to get through this whole thing, and I was glad that we'd sent the others there. And as I was looking over, Destiny pointed out that there was a dial on the control board that led to a tertiary breaker that had a malfunctioning setting that if it was put in just the right spot, it would, like, oh, no. He just pointed out that if the dam broke, it could destroy all the generators. I said, well, yeah, but that's a solid dam there. And he pointed out that there was a dial that if put at the right setting would short circuit and take down a drain, which would flood a part of the dam that wasn't supposed to be filled, which would put a break in the dam and could flood the whole thing. A simple dial. I closed my eyes. It would be so easy. But it would cost so much. That kind of flooding would destroy all the generators, but it would flood the city and kill tons of Profithians. I pointed that out to Destiny. He didn't seem to care. Less Profithians, that was the plan. I said, and what about our team that's down there? It'd take them out as well. Destiny didn't respond. I never should have had to make that decision. To take lives. But it would save millions of lives in the long run. It would stop the war early, and I heard the clicking of the dial on the board moving, and I opened my eyes to see my hand on the dial. Destiny had taken control again. I tried to turn the dial back to where it was, but the damage was already done. The drain had short-circuited, and water had begun to course through, and it couldn't be closed again, not against that force. I couldn't see it on the screens, but I knew what was happening. I said, "No, Destiny!" And he didn't respond. Crimson came down at my shout and came to look. I said, "It's all right, buddy," as I pulled out my mobile, and I couldn't see the screen, but I sired to call Scar, and I saw her stop working to pick up, and I said, "Scar, there's a flood coming your way, and you need to stop it." And she said, "What?" I said, there's a break in the dam, and it's going to stop the generators, but it's going to kill a lot of people, and I need you to stop that." And I could already see that she was shooting up onto the top of a bluff that overlooked a little gully to the side of the dam, and she said, "On it," and hung up. And I reached out to call Ferendo and had to sire again because the screen was completely dark. And I looked on the screen, and his team had just come up to the generator field, and they were fighting some guards, and so Ferendo wasn't answering, and I thought, come on, pick up, as I looked back and forth between the dam and my team. Finally they stopped, and Ferendo picked up out of breath, and he said, "Gee, what do you need?" And I said, "I need you to get the team out of there. There's a flood coming your way." And I looked at where they were. They were just at the mouth of a gully that led right down to the city, not the place to be. I said, "There's a bluff just to the south of the generator field. That's your closest high ground. I need you to get everyone there as fast as you can." And he gave an affirmative answer and hung up. And I watched, terrified, but knowing there was nothing I could do. I was across the city, and even if I took Crimson, it would take us half an hour to get to where the others were, and there wasn't going to be time. And so I watched helplessly as water began to pour out of the side of the dam, and it ran down the scaffolding there and into a small ditch, which quickly filled up and began to fill the gully. And Scar stood at the far end of the gully, just at the entrance to the generator field. And she calmly reached into her pockets and pulled out 2 massive bars of metal. She slammed them into the ground on either side of her and stepped in front of them. And she reached again for her pockets. But instead of reaching inside, she grabbed the zippers and began to unzip the pockets. I'd always imagined the zippers were just to close the pockets, but they went the other way too, and she zipped up her back and pulled off her jacket to connect the 2 zippers and opened the one massive flap that was her pocket. And By this point, water was beginning to trickle through the gully, but as it narrowed down, it became a wall of water that rushed towards Scar. And she braced herself, putting the jacket against her with the massive gaping pocket open in front of her, and she held herself in front of the bars of metal using her magic to stay in place as the wall of water hit her. And she stumbled back but was able to hold against the torrent as it rushed along her feet and slowly rose, filling the pocket in front of her. She was making a difference, but water still rushed past her on either side and through the generator field. Now, the generators weren't electric, but as the water hit them and filled their systems, they short-circuited and the ISO died down, so that was working. But the water continued past the generators through the 4-foot hulls, corridors between each of them, and made its way through the gully. It washed over the feet of Ferrando and his team as they made their way forward to the higher ground. Where they were coming up, there was a wall of lumber and tightly packed generators that were blocking their way, and so they had to make their way around to get to the bluff. And I watched tensely as they fought their way through the rising water. It was only inches high, but it was rushing with speed at this point, and it was only growing higher. Further on, as it cleared through the generator field, it again concentrated through another gully that led down into the city, and the city walls there made it all the worse. The water was piling up against the timbers and forcing its way through the entrance into the city with greater force than it would have without the walls, and it was slamming into the first lines of homes and tearing into them, making muddy water and flotsam flow through the streets. Up above Scar, I looked back on her, and the water level had risen to above her head, and I could see where she was, where the water level was lowering, but it still cascaded over top of her. And I watched as she broke free of the water and threw herself on top of another bluff to gasp for air. And she reached into her pocket and pulled out a sodden Jedi air breather. And she took some stabilizing breaths before putting it in her mouth and throwing herself into the air closer to the dam. And holding the thing like a shield in front of her, she threw herself closer to the source of where the water was pounding through the water. And she went down, but she wasn't there for long before she came back up again. And as she tried to come up through the water, it washed her almost halfway through the gully before she made her way out. And she coughed up water and threw up on the bluff and looked up startled toward the dam. I couldn't hear anything that was going on, but I could tell she was hearing something. And I watched as a chunk of the wall burst out. The pressure had built so much that it opened the floodgates all the more, and 5 times as much water was pouring out. Scar threw herself higher up the bank as the water flooded the entire gully and stormed through the generator field. By this point, the Firendo and his group had gotten to the bluff, and they were making their way up. It was steep, and so they had to climb their way along the top. And even as they were getting there, the second storm hadn't arrived, but the water was increasing, like it sent a wave even before the second wall of water, and that was strong enough to wash away 3 of the Ceremaians, and I watched as they slipped under the surface and disappeared towards the city. The others made it onto the bluff and were climbing their way up. 4 had made it safely to the top by the time that the wall of water crested the low hill in front of them and crashed along the side of the bluff, washing away all but 2 of them. The 2 got to the top and were pulled up by the other 4, but the rest were gone in the water. And I watched in despair as the water continued and slammed against the walls of the city, and until they just poured over top and were strong enough that they took down the timbers, and the wall of water made its way through the city, crushing buildings, and I couldn't hear it, but I could imagine the sound of the destruction, the Prophithians screaming out in fear and pain. We'd evacuated other places, but those were places where they had travelers. These Prophithians didn't have travelers. They were trapped. And the water made its way through the city. It didn't get through the entire city, but it was enough to kill thousands of Prophithians, and still the water raged on. Scar had finally gotten her strength up, and she shot up onto the top of the dam, overlooking the lake that was there. And I watched as she set her sodden jacket on the ground. It was wet through, and the claw marks where Crimson had torn through were opening all the wider every time she went under. She reached into the pocket and pulled out a massive metal weight and set it on the dam before tugging the jacket onto her. She took the weight in her hands and threw herself into the lake and disappeared. She had her Jedi breather. And as she sank down to the bottom, a whirlpool resolved over top of where she was. It was going to help, but what more could it do? The flood continued to rage, and I sat back watching in silence. All I could do was see the pain that was caused. That was the only comfort I could give. And Crimson watched, waiting, recognizing that I was in pain. I finally cried out to Destiny and said, "Why did you do this? It didn't have to be this way." And he didn't answer. I said, "This isn't a war of extermination, it's a war of isolation. We could have sent them to the world of becoming." And I wanted a response of some kind. I knew what Destiny would have said, but I wanted him to say it so that I could be angry at something. Nothing. And so I kept watching every building that was torn down by the flood. Eventually, Scar broke through the water and collapsed in a heap on the side of the lake. She didn't have her jacket, and she collapsed on the ground, and I knew my people weren't going to be hurt anymore. Everything was done that could be done. I turned to Crimson. I said, "Let's go." I hopped on his back, and we came up through the roof and made our way along the south side of the city, back to the gate. I couldn't help at this point, but I needed to get my people out. We got to where the gate was, and I waited for Itaro to open the gate. Nothing happened. So I finally pulled out my phone, and I couldn't see anything, and I couldn't sire, and so it took me a while to get to actually calling her. And she finally picked up, and she said, "Gee, where are you guys?" I said, "I'm waiting at the gate, and nothing's happening. Where are you?" And she said, "That's you?" I said, it's a long story, but yes, I need you to take me through." And I could tell she was hesitant, but a moment later, Crimson and I were standing in the sun, and Itaro shied back. My darkness was all the easier to see in the daylight. And I said, "There's been an emergency. I need to take the gate to get the others. They're on the far side of the city, and they're not going to be able to come." And she reluctantly gave me the gate, and I said, "I need you to get medics over here. They might need medical attention, and get towels." She was confused, but she went to follow my orders, and I disappeared back through the gate and this time went along the north side of the city. I could see Profithians gathering at the edges of the city, walking for higher ground. The water was pooling in the lower parts of the city and quickly rising. And I got to where the generator field was. Crimson easily leapt the 30-foot gap to get to the bluff where Ferrendo's team was. Thankfully, he was one of the ones that had survived. And as I came to him and the others, they didn't look angry or sorry, just exhausted. And I shared that. And Ferrendo, he said, "Gee, we should have gone with your plan. I'm sorry. I thought I knew, but now the others are dead, and it's because of me." And I said, "Ferrendo, we'll talk about this when there's not a mission to be done. I still need to get to Scar. Right now, you need to get these men to safety. I'll send you through the portal." And Ferrendo said, "I'm so sorry." I said, "No." I hugged him and I said, "It's gonna be okay." And I felt sick saying those words when thousands were dying. But what else could I say? I sent them through, and Crimson took me onto where Scar was. As we drew near, she tensed up and pulled herself up on the ground. Even after she recognized us, she was still tense. I decided to leave Crimson there and walked up to where she was. And she finally just collapsed on the bank again. She landed pretty close to where the water was, but it had been draining, and so there was a good 30 feet between her and where the water was last time where the water level was. And I looked at her in the dark. Little beadlets of water on her little face, puddling underneath her. And she said, "Is everyone safe?" And I said, "Everyone that can be. We lost 30 of the Ceremans, but Ferrando is safe." And she said, "Darren's safe." And I'd completely forgotten about Darren. I said, "He's been missing since before we got to the Colosseum." And she said, "What? Where is he?" And I said, "I don't know, but if there's anyone that can handle themselves, it's Darren." She closed her eyes and she said, "I know. He's so strong, but he has so many enemies. They sent a Teletubby against us, and terrified to think what they're doing to him." And I said, "It's gonna be all right." Lying again, for the sake of comfort. I said, "Well, we've done what we can. I sent everyone else back. Let's get you back." And she said, "No, I'm fine." She stood up to prove it, but she was shivering, and I could still see the gash was sunken and pale, more than it had any right to be. I reached into my scabbard and gave her a healing crystal, and she took it. She said, "I can't leave anyway. I have to wait for my jacket to be free from the water again." And so I followed her to the water's edge, and as we walked along, the ground was marshy and soft, and we saw all these plants that had been underwater before. By this point, the water level was almost below the drains where the break was happening, and so the water flow had slowed, but it was still wreaking havoc through the city, even though it had quieted down here. We stepped up to the water's edge and looked through the break in the dam where it had just gotten worse and worse and broken straight through. And we could see the city on the far side, hazy through the fog, but glowing in the red. We could see the silvery streets reflecting red lights and rippling with the moving waters. It was peaceful in a sickening way. We stood there, and Scar smiled despite herself. He just said, "You want to know the one thing that's been going through my mind?" I said, "What is it?" She said, "I'm the girl that tried to stop the waterfall. I tried to hold it up. I tried to contain it. I even tried to send it somewhere else. But all the same, it flooded the city and sent the Profithians away." I put my arm around her and held her in the darkness, in the silence. End of chapter 23.